The lounge. The dimly lit cocktail lounge was a relic of the early 1900s. Amber light shone through the intricate Art Nouveau fixtures and graced the fine woodwork of the antique furnishings. The place had been around so long, it was an institution in Old Town Savannah. It was beautiful, and yet he wished he hadn't bought it. The lounge was bleeding money. He had thought opening his own business would give him freedom. Instead, he found himself trapped, just like everyone else, working to live, living to work. It occurred to him that he used to have friends once. Now he had only his drunken regulars and his fake friends on social media. If he fell over dead, he knew a few might say nice things about him online. None would likely take the time out of their busy lives to show up to his funeral. He figured he couldn't blame them. It wasn't like he ever got out to talk to anyone face to face. Sure, he sent text messages day in and day out, and the occasional meme. He wasn't sure why, but it just wasn't the same as being with another person. Maybe it was because people remembered faces easier than names, and he was one of those faces that just weren't around much. He had condemned himself to be just an abstract name on a screen. As for his regulars, they'd probably just shrug their shoulders and move on to the bar down the street. His name would fade into oblivion, but maybe they'd remember his face. Who knows? He worked the old bar like he did every night. A tip here, an extra glug of bourbon there, same old, same old. The clink of glasses against the mahogany bar top was drowned out by the guffawing customers telling crude jokes. Regulars. Beer foamed over the rim of their pints as they waved their glasses around. He made sure their glasses were full with whatever obscure craft beer they demanded. He was wiping up a spilled drink when a young woman appeared through the glass door. Not a regular. She fumbled with the door handle before stepping inside. Her eyes darted around as her tiny pink lips parted in apparent confusion. He waved. She looked as if she was lost. Then she locked her gaze on his upraised hand. Her long pearl necklace made a tapping sound as it gently bounced against her chest while she strutted toward the bar. The patron's eyes shifted, and their commotion died down as she approached. The dim amber light of the lounge danced as it caught the bouncing beads of her slinky champagne-colored dress, which hung loose from her bare shoulders. She wore a thin crystal headband with a peacock feather on the side. He thought it was a bit odd, yet tasteful. She sat at the bar, and the chatter resumed. "What'll it be?" he asked. "An Aviation," said the woman. "Favorite drink?" "I've got to try it. It's the newest thing." He slid the cool lavender cocktail to his new guest. She swirled it a few times and sipped it with an indifferent expression. He tilted his head, hoping to make eye contact, fishing for a response. Her head hung down as she twirled the cherry in her drink. Before he could say a word, she lit up a cigarette. Silence filled the lounge. All eyes were on the cigarette dangling from the young woman's mouth. He couldn't afford another fine. "You can't smoke that in here," he said. The young woman took a long, deep puff and exhaled the smoke through her nostrils. "Why not?" she asked, and then took another slow puff. "Because it's the law." She flicked the ashes into an empty glass. "Nonsense. If you don't put that out, you're going to have to leave." She slowly tilted her head up from her drink. Her hazel eyes met his. It was the first time she had bothered to look at him. "I will do no such thing." He felt his face grow hot. He snatched the cigarette out of her hand and threw it to the floor to extinguish the health code violation. But by the time he snuffed it out with his foot, she already had another freshly lit cigarette in her mouth. He couldn't believe the audacity of the strange young woman. He leaned forward. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "Dolores." One of his regulars gave a loud, exaggerated cough. He didn't want to have Dolores kicked out of the lounge, yet he didn't want to show weakness in front of his regulars either. In fact, he didn't want to have to deal with any of it. The only thing he wanted was to count his till after the lounge closed and figure out whether he had lost money or broken even that day. He closed his tired eyes and squeezed the bridge of his nose. "Listen, lady. Dolores." "Listen, Dolores. Can you do me a favor and put that thing out? I want to speak to the owner. I am the owner. Please, for Christ's sake." She gave a wry smile, the first one that had crossed her melancholic face since she entered. Dolores took one last puff and put the cigarette out in a half-empty glass of beer. "That's all you had to say?" The next day he came down from his loft above the lounge, ready for another evening of work. He sifted through envelopes that all read "Repossession Warning." He had 30 days to make payment, or the lounge would be taken from him. He didn't see how he could possibly make his payment in time. He thought about just giving up, but vowed to keep working until the bitter end. He had poured a part of his soul into fixing up that old lounge, and he was going to give it every last drop of sweat he had. He owed himself that much. He wiped his tables in the empty lounge and gave a silent laugh, remembering last night's strange guest. It was funny now that he was rid of her. He tried to change the subject of his daydreaming, but found the odd woman dominating his thoughts. There was something about her, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He adjusted his tie and waistcoat before flipping over his open sign. The evening regulars shuffled in. Another Friday. He could already tell there were not enough customers to cover his expenses. Not even close. He liked the company and the energy and the bustle of the crowd. Customers came in with their friends and family and talked with one another. He usually exchanged pleasantries and the occasional small talk, but in the end, he was just the guy pouring their drinks. It was always a one-way conversation with his customers. They complained about their problems, and he listened. It was his job. He was pouring another drink when he heard a familiar voice. "I'll have an Aviation." He froze. Golden bourbon overflowed the shot glass he was filling. He slowly looked up. Dolores sat directly in front of him as she adjusted her short auburn hair while peering into a small mirror. She pushed forward a stack of silver dollars without taking her eyes off her reflection. He made her the cocktail and slid it toward her. She continued fixing her hair and said nothing. Dolores carried herself with a combination of old-fashioned respectability and a touch of sass. The same long pearl necklace she had worn earlier graced her neck. That night, she wore a black one-shoulder dress covered with delicate geometric patterns made up of silver sequins. Vintage, yet timeless. Refined, yet revealing. She was dressed like she had somewhere to go, and in a room full of casually dressed people, she stood out. Who was she dressed up for, he wondered. She came alone, yet she was the talk of the lounge, and it seemed that word had gotten out. The dead air quickly gave way to the sound of laughter and drunken revelry. The place was bustling. In fact, he had never seen it so busy. The women wanted to talk to Dolores, and the men wanted to dance with her. Yesterday, she infuriated him. Today, she intrigued him. Dolores seemed to be enjoying the attention. He wanted to talk to her, but she was so popular he couldn't get a word in. Then the man Dolores was talking to went to the bathroom. It was his chance. "You seem to like the flapper look." "Doesn't everyone?" He turned and began drying off his glassware. It was strange. Half of a bartender's job was listening to the woes of their patrons. But unlike the others, Dolores was tight-lipped. To his surprise, even he was tongue-tied. He simply nodded, not knowing how to push the conversation forward. "Place has changed," said Dolores. It was a morsel of conversation he was quick to devour. "It was abandoned. I bought it and fixed it up." She rubbed her fingers against the Cuban mahogany bar top. "Abandoned?" "For decades. Used to be the classiest place in town. You must have seen it before the renovation." Dolores stared into her violet-hued drink. He couldn't tell whether she didn't hear his question or if she was simply ignoring him. "Who lives upstairs?" asked Dolores. "I do." She simply nodded and said nothing. More people poured into the lounge. He ran around, checking in on customers, and his new absinthe fountain was proving to be popular. What's old was new again. As he chatted up his customers, his eyes inevitably made their way back toward the mysterious woman with the pallid face and haunting eyes sitting at his bar. Dolores sat alone. It seemed only sadness was painted on her porcelain face. To him, she seemed like an enigma begging to be understood, and with each passing moment, his desire to penetrate the veil of the young woman grew. She seemed to be a bit of a lost soul, like himself. He never had the chance to meet a girl or go anywhere other than the lounge. Sure, he had flings with women he had met online. At first, he thought it was the greatest thing ever. Yet, he had grown weary of the superficiality of it all. His desires were always torn between the carnal and the emotional. One could easily be satiated. The other was much harder to come by. As he was about to make his way over to Dolores, there was a sharp tap on his shoulder. He found himself face to face with a customer complaining about their appetizer. By the time he corrected the issue and made his way back to the bar, Dolores was gone. He ran out the entryway to see if he could catch her on the sidewalk, but she had disappeared. Dolores came on Saturday as well. Customers followed. He didn't think the lounge could fit any more people within its walls, but it did. And there was Dolores in the middle of it all, almost like a conductor setting the tempo for the crowd. The place was so packed, the fire department came and gave him a warning for being over his occupancy limit. He couldn't believe it. He only got out of the fine when Dolores somehow managed to smooth-talk the fire chief. He made more money that single weekend than he had made in the last 4 months. It was incredible. Monday came, and it was slow. No customers and no money. The only noise in his bar was the clink of glass liquor bottles as he straightened them on a shelf. Without its people, the lounge was just 4 walls, bereft of life. Before he could sulk, he was startled by a pleasant voice behind him. "An Aviation, please." A shudder shot up his spine when he saw Dolores. He didn't even hear her come in through the door. He cleared his throat and struggled to hide his elation. Before she could open her purse, he mixed up her favorite drink and slid it to her. "It's on the house." Dolores gave a slight nod and held the drink up to her lips. Before she took a sip, she paused. "Won't you have a drink with me?" He normally didn't drink on the job, but this time he made an exception. She avoided eye contact, except when she sipped her drink. When she held it to her scarlet lips, she took long, slow glances at him. Their eyes met. There was something both alluring and cryptic in those hazel eyes. He found himself trying to peer through them to figure out what lay beyond. She put down her drink and averted her gaze, as if to prevent him from attempting to read her. He broke the silence. "So, why come here, of all places?" "That's a silly question. People don't go to bars for the overpriced booze. It's cheaper to drink alone." "I never thought of it that way. Actually, it makes a lot of sense now that I think about it." "We're all trapped alone in our own little worlds, aren't we?" "Yeah, I suppose that's true." Dolores looked up at him with those striking eyes of hers, and he found himself trapped. "Are you lonely working here all by yourself every day?" The question caught him off guard. It was a nagging question he had always done his best to bury. He told himself he wasn't lonely. He had his lounge in the busy heart of downtown, and he had his regulars. How can one be lonely with so many people around? He fumbled with a glass as he tried to think of what to say. Dolores gazed at him. It wasn't even a brief gaze, but a long, slow stare that she made no attempt to hide. Now she was trying to read him. He felt naked, for there was no screen, no fluffed-up profile or edited photo to hide behind. "You seem lonely to me," she said. "Maybe, on some days." Dolores nodded, as if they both shared the same malady, and after a long pause, she spoke. "They used to dance here, you know," she said. He decided to try something forward, perhaps foolish, but he found himself compelled to do it. There was something about Dolores that pulled him toward her, like gravity. "Used to?" He stood and took Dolores's arm. She seemed amused by his forwardness and followed him. He fed quarters into the old jukebox. It began blaring out a few contemporary songs he liked. Dolores's thin brows rose as she covered her ears. "What is this awful racket you're playing?" "Racket?" She nudged him aside and reached into his pocket for quarters. She fumbled with the jukebox until his choice of music died down. Then lively jazz filled the room. Dolores nodded with delight and returned. As he was about to take her hand, she began dancing on her own. Her tranquil expression disappeared as her face glowed with excitement. Her arms and legs swung back and forth, while the fringes on her dress bopped wildly. It wasn't a dance he was familiar with. He shrugged his shoulders. What did he know? He couldn't keep up with the trends these days. After all, he had a business to keep from falling apart. Though, despite his best efforts, he wasn't doing a very good job. Dolores motioned for him to join her. Oddly, there were no customers, even for a Monday. He usually had at least a few regulars come by. He locked the front doors so that they had the lounge all to themselves. Then he sucked down his drink in one gulp and danced with Dolores. After too many songs to count, they collapsed into chairs. He poured 2 tall glasses of water on the table between them. Then Dolores opened up. In fact, she wouldn't stop talking. He learned that she was a writer, and she loved pearls and read old novels he had never heard of. She came across as a free spirit, even though she was quiet about her past. They continued to talk, to drink, to dance. Not once did either of them pull out a smartphone or any other distraction. Her focus was entirely on him, and he couldn't pull his eyes or ears away from her. Though talkative, she wasn't a selfish conversationalist. She wanted to know about him, his life, his dreams. People rarely asked him about himself. It had always been his job to listen and to ask. Most people he met seemed to like to tell things rather than ask things. Though he enjoyed her attention, he wanted Dolores to stop asking so many questions because he wanted to know about her. It was strange. They seemed to have nothing in common, yet he had never met someone who made him feel so at ease. He spoke more to her that night than he had spoken to anyone in what must have been years. From then on, every weekend was bustling. The customers seemed to change too. It almost seemed as if Dolores' style had rubbed off on them, because they all came in suits and dresses and all manner of formal wear. Still, he closed the lounge every Monday, and every Monday evening Dolores would arrive, dressed to the nines, even though it was just the two of them. She must have rubbed off on him as well, for he too began wearing his nicest clothes, typically a midnight black lounge suit with a crimson tie. Sure, it was old-fashioned to dress up, but so what? He wanted to dress his best for her. It was one of those Mondays that he gave a long sigh of relief when he opened a letter that read, "Loan paid in full." He had done it. By some miracle, he had managed to pay off his entire loan. The lounge was his now, really his. Like every Monday, Dolores entered the lounge. Without saying a word, she walked up to him and adjusted his tie. She revealed a tiny silver object that looked like a barbell and proceeded to place it in his collar. "You simply must wear a collar pin," she said. She stood back with her hand on her chin and studied him for a moment. Then she nodded with satisfaction. They usually spent their evenings talking, laughing, dancing, and dreaming out loud. There was a depth and an intelligence about Dolores that enamored him. He wondered what else there was in life other than enjoying the simple pleasure of another's company. He reached over and placed his hand atop hers. Dolores' skin was soft, yet cool to the touch. She pulled her hand away until, after a pause, she placed her hand on his. Dolores then got up and held out her hand. "How about one more dance? I want a slow one this time," she said. A smooth jazz ballad played, Dolores' choice, of course, and she rested her head upon his shoulder while they danced. He touched the exposed skin of her back. "Do you feel cold?" he asked. "No, I'm always warm here with you." She uttered the words as if some dark shadow was cast over her soul. Then she said something that filled him with dread. "I don't have much time left." "You've got all the time in the world. You're still young." She pulled her head back and gave her usual wry smile. "Am I? Why are you leaving?" She did not answer his question, but her countenance registered despair. It seemed as if she might cry, but then she perked up with a weak smile. "Just hold me, dance with me. Isn't it all very odd?" "What's odd?" "With so many people in the world, one wouldn't think that the affection of another person would be as elusive as it is." She might as well have been reading his mind. With that, she placed her head back on his shoulder. He leaned his head against hers and could smell the scent of lavender emanating from her short auburn hair. He was surprised to find it was already 5 a.m. They had been at it all night long, and she told him she had to get going. At the doorway, Dolores stopped and stood there, holding her wrist with an unsure expression. He tried to kiss her. She turned her face to the side, so his lips plowed into her cheek. "I'm sorry I have to leave. You have to understand that my time is running out, and I won't be in town for very much longer. I don't want to give you the wrong impression." "You've only given me the best of impressions." "I have to leave tomorrow. Please understand that I won't be coming back, ever." He felt overcome with despair. He'd finally found someone he could connect with in a way he had never connected before. And now she was leaving. At first, he thought himself a fool for investing as much time as he did with her. Then he quickly realized he regretted none of it. In fact, it was a moment he'd likely cherish forever. He didn't know why she had to leave, and thought about asking or even demanding an answer. Who was he kidding? He had tried countless times to pry Dolores' secrets from her, and if she wouldn't speak with as many cocktails as he had given her, then she never would. Such reluctance seemed out of character for her. To him, she seemed like the most open person he had ever talked with. He realized he could only salvage the limited time they had left. "Then let's spend the day together," he said. "But it will only be a day." "It will be like music, then. Just because the music goes away doesn't mean it wasn't worthwhile. When the violinist stops playing, does that mean it was all for naught? Her eyes welled up, and she smiled. I would like that very much. He wiped the tears from her cheeks, and she looked up at him with those enigmatic hazel eyes, which told him exactly what he should do. He cradled the back of her head and kissed her. Her soft lips were cool, but he had never felt so warm in all his life. That morning, Savannah was covered in a heavy mist as they walked atop time-worn cobblestones. He held her hand as they strolled under the gnarled branches of oak trees with their tangles of Spanish moss hanging. The smell of savory southern cooking filled the humid air as they passed through the city's lush squares, graced with grand monuments erected by the dead of eras past. As they sauntered past a row of weathered brick shops, she paused. He caught her eyeing a pair of pearl earrings in the window. He tried to take her inside, but she politely declined. He went inside anyway and came out with the pearl earrings. They matched her favorite necklace that she always wore. Her cheeks grew flush, but she did not say no. She gave a smile, her broadest yet, as she placed them in her ears. By the time the day began to die, they were inseparable. Still, she refused to tell him why she had to leave. At first, he had wondered if she had a husband, but she told him she was single. They had something deeper than infatuation or lust. They were lost souls that had finally found each other. When he touched Dolores's hand, he felt as if a great void in his life had been filled. With her, the overcast sky parted, and the gray world around him filled with color. The white sun faded, and tired wooden stairs creaked as they climbed through the narrow confines of the stairwell toward his loft. The second story was usually desolate. Only the crows outside his windowsill and the mice between his walls kept him company. He was the only person that lived there. It was nice to have his solitude interrupted for a change. Dolores navigated the stairs with ease, despite the hallway light being turned off. He flicked the light switch on as they kissed deeply. He struggled to unlock the door to his loft. It finally opened, and they continued their passion inside. Her body glistening with sweat, Dolores lay bare-breasted beside him. She wrapped her arms around him and looked up at him. "Will you hold me all night?" All night. Her expression became serious, angry almost. He thought it a trivial thing to take so seriously. "Promise me." "I promise." That remark pleased her. She gave a gentle nod and then rested her head on his chest. He felt her cool breath against his flesh, and it caused the hairs on his arms to stand on end. After his eyes grew heavy, he held her, just as he had promised. Sunlight gleamed through his skylight. He woke as he felt the warmth of a new day against his face. He rolled over and felt the other side of the bed for Dolores. She was gone. "Dolores?" No answer. He got up, ran about his loft, and even peeked outside in the hallway in search of her, but she was nowhere to be found. A feeling of immense dread overcame him. He knew she had to leave, but until she was gone, he didn't believe it would happen. Then he noticed a folded piece of paper on the side of his bed. He opened it. It was a letter written in the most exquisite penmanship he had ever seen. "My dearest, it pains me to leave you. It is no choice of my own. We cannot yet stay together forever. Remember what you said? Our time together was like music. I have something for you. In the far corner of your bedroom, you'll find a section of floorboard. It's looser than the others. Underneath, you'll find my gift. Until we meet again. Love, Dolores." He eventually found the section of floorboard. He pried open the board with a flathead screwdriver, and it popped off with ease. The inside was covered with dirty cobwebs. He found an old yellowed manuscript with curled edges. It was typed, and he presumed it was a draft for a novel or some such. Underneath it lay a tarnished silver jewelry box, covered with years of dust. He pulled it free from its hiding place. The old hinges squeaked as he opened it. Inside, he found a long pearl necklace, some silver dollars, and a stack of black and white photos. He flipped through the photos. A few were pictures of the old lounge in its heyday. Others were of the interior of his loft, which he found interesting because no one had lived upstairs for decades. The walls were covered in Art Deco wallpaper, a Tiffany stained glass lamp perched upon a round end table, and beside it sat a velvet couch with claw feet. The next photo sent a shiver up his spine. It was a photo of Dolores, sitting on the antique couch. She wore her unmistakable pearl necklace. On the back of the photo was a distinctive signature, Dolores's signature. He wasn't able to find a trace of Dolores online, via social media, nor any other conventional means. He even paid money to a few of those creepy people finder sites and instantly felt dirty and guilty for doing so. But he needed to find her, if only to call her or even to send her a letter. He had nearly given up hope when he decided to make one last-ditch effort to find her. He resorted to going through the dusty archives of the library. As he ran his finger along a long list of names on yellowed paper, he found the only name that matched hers. But it couldn't be hers. Out of desperation rather than logic, he decided to visit the woman's last known location. He walked a gravel path surrounded by lofty oak trees and manicured lawns. His heart sank when he looked down at the weathered marble tombstone among hundreds of forgotten graves. The letters were barely legible. The person below was slowly being washed from history. The tombstone read, Dolores R. Hamilton, born in 1897, died in 1923. Yesterday was the anniversary of her death. Her body had been found in the apartment above the lounge shortly after she died. An old newspaper article had said she had gotten ill and died alone. She never even got a funeral. He found the pearl earrings he had bought her, neatly placed atop the tombstone. His arm trembled as a single rose fell from his hand. Dolores. Her name was Dolores.